Many of your projects have been in the true crime genre. What attracts you to this?
Well, I think my original attraction to true crime was it was going to pay the bills because it was the appetite, it was the meal that the television networks wanted. For a long time, I would say half to maybe more than half of what was on CBS or NBC was true crime. And then when Lifetime became the preeminent supplier, they wanted true crime. So I think at the start, it was just, that was the world I was in, and that was, I had to learn. And then eventually I realized that I could become a storyteller in that world, and I didn't have to do it the way everyone else was doing it, which was kind of a straightforward police narrative, that there were other ways to tell true crime. And so I tried to find the emotional hook in a true crime movie. And so I would make stories that weren't as much about the crime, but as much about the effect it had on the people who either were the victims or were the police or were the criminals, and how did their lives change and what were the emotions they were going through. And you know, we did Capture the Green River Killer, which Tom Cavanaugh was nominated for awards, and we won the DGC award for outstanding miniseries. And that movie is about a man's crisis of conscience, of giving up on God, because for 25 years he would constantly be finding these murdered young women in between 15 and 25 in Seattle, and he couldn't find this guy. And for 25 years he chased this guy, and he was a deeply devoted Christian. And at one point he just turned to God and said, "You can't possibly exist if this is what you aren't allowing to happen, and you aren't letting me fix it. I was put here to find this guy and arrest him and stop these women from dying. And that's my calling, and I'm not doing my job. So where are you?" So we made a movie about that, a miniseries about that. And I still to this day, I think it's the highest rated miniseries on LMN, and we won all kinds of awards. And the person who wrote it wrote Agnes of God. So that was right in his wheelhouse. And I chose him because we wanted to explore that as opposed to what was the crime? How did the girls die? How were they killed? How did they find him? What were the clues? It wasn't a detective story. It was an emotional story.
How do you find these stories? Yeah, I'm sure you scour the news and you look at what's on Goodreads or different things. But what is it that calls to you about a certain story?
The thing that people have to remember about all genres is, in the end, do you care, and is it a good story? It doesn't matter if it's a romantic comedy or a true crime or a Western, all of which I've done. You still want to find, does it pull at your heartstrings? Does it make you feel something? Does it make you feel angry? Does it make you feel sad? Does it communicate to you a personal experience? Do you feel for the characters? Do you root for the protagonist? Do you root against the antagonist? Those are all the things that have to happen in a story. I remember a couple of screenwriters early on would say to me when I started in the true crime business, "Well, this is what really happened." I said, that doesn't matter. What really happened is almost irrelevant. If it's not a good story, if what really happened is the excuse we have for not being good storytellers, then we need to get another job. It really happened is not the answer to a story flaw, to not being able to have a second act twist, to not being able to have a satisfying third act. Those things still have to happen even when you're in true crime. So of course, when I could find a great book, as I did with Capture the Green River Killer, or establish a relationship with a great crime writer like Ann Rule, who was probably the greatest crime writer of all time, may she rest in peace, I would say that also helped because, for instance, Ann, I made 3 of her movies. She had a nose for telling a story like nobody I knew. And she, again, wasn't just interested in the crime. She was interested in the characters around the crime.
And that some of that came from her own story, right? That sort of put her on the map.
Well, Ann Rule's story is amazing. I mean, Ann Rule was, she was a crime reporter, a crime journalist. Her brother was a cop, her dad was a cop, I think her grandfather was a cop, and her uncles were cops. So she grew up in that world. She knew she wasn't going to be a cop, so she decided to be a crime journalist. And I think she wrote under a pseudonym because women didn't do that then. And I think when she wrote her first book, she wrote it under a pseudonym. And she was living in Seattle, and she was volunteering at a suicide hotline. And the guy sitting next to her was a very attractive guy from the University of Washington, was also volunteering. And they would show up on the same night every week and talk. And they became friends, and they would go out for coffee afterwards and, you know, kind of decompress from what I'm sure was not a fun night, and they became friends. And then one day she turns on a TV and he's been arrested and it's Ted Bundy. And so she had access to him. She talked to him after he was arrested, and she wrote The Deliberate Stranger, I think was the name of the book, and that put Ann Rule on the map. And I think that's the first time, I could be wrong, but it was right around the first time she put her own name, Ann Rule, on a book. And so she always drew from that. But I did a Rob Lowe movie with her. I did a Gina Gershon movie with her. And both times she was still, and these were books that had been around for 10 years at least, she was still in touch with the victims' families. So she called them when we were doing the movie and said, hey, we're making a movie and this is who's going to play your mom or your dad or your brother or sister. And then even when the movie came on, she called them after it aired. So yeah, she maintained those relationships. They were like her children. The books were like her children, and the victims' families were like her children as well.
Once you find a story that you want to then have some screenwriter adapt, what are your steps when it comes to the true crime genre?
Well, with true crime, obviously the first thing you have to do is break it down and come up with an outline and a treatment. So that's the first step with the screenwriter, is what are the story beats? On a broad scale, what's the beginning, middle, and end? What's the first act, second act, twist, and third act? Even if you're working in an 8-act structure for television movies, you're still in a 3-act structure. So that's the first bit, is what story are we telling? Because with a lot of them, there's, it could be a 10-year story, or you could just tell a sliver of it. So you have to decide what's the story we want to tell. And once we decide, like, who we rooting for, who we rooting against, are we going to see the crimes, are we not going to see the crimes? A lot of kind of structural bones of the story you have to figure out first. That's a lot of conversations before you put pen to paper. And then you come up with a story outline, and then treatment. And then that has to get approved by whoever's paying for it, whether it's a network or a studio. And then you write a screenplay. And then, the first draft is the writer's draft, and that's when he gets to do whatever he wants or she wants. And then from that point forward, now it takes a village. So now the network or studio gets their votes, and I get my notes, and if we get it to an actor, the actor gets their notes. And so at that point form, now you're in that place of how do we get this made? And so now you're adjusting that story and that screenplay. And then when you get ordered, there's a whole other process that you don't have in fiction, which is you now have to go to the errors and omissions lawyer and go through the script, page by page, line by line, period by period, and make sure that what you're telling is true and you haven't defamed anyone. And so there's a lawyer that forces the screenwriter to annotate their script page by page. Every single thing in it has to be based on something. And if it's fiction, like if they say, okay, well, there's a cop and we know that he went home and figured it out at home, but we know that because the next day he went in and made an arrest, but we don't have any actual documentation that he went home and figured it out. But we're going to write a scene where he goes home and figures it out. And that's the connective tissue between when he doesn't catch the killer and he does catch the killer. Well, they'll allow a certain amount of that in your screenplay, maybe 10%, 20%. If the audience pays attention, they'll know how much is fiction, because on a television movie, if it says based on a true story, it's almost completely true. There's very little fictionalization. If it says inspired by true events or inspired by a true story, that means the insurance company and the lawyers have said, you took too many liberties. We're still going to say true story, but we're not going to say based on. We're going to say inspired by. And that allows you more leadway. I always tried to get to based on. I liked my movies to be as close to the truth as possible. Perfect Sisters was based on a true story. Capture the Green River Killer was based on a true story. So I always fought to get as close to the based on moniker as possible, but it wasn't always the case.
If there's a book out about the case, are you then going to the author to adapt it and get their rights, or do you have to get the life story rights of the individual or the estate of whomever is involved in the story?
So the important thing to remember when you're doing true crime that's based on a book is, if you're optioning the book, and you don't have to, if you're optioning the book doesn't come with any rights. So if you're going to do a story about, I did this movie, The Grim Sleeper, for Lifetime, which I directed and produced. And it was based on the work of a journalist at the LA Weekly, a young woman who was a fact checker and figured out that there was a serial killer preying on African American women in South Central Los Angeles. She figured it out. She wasn't even a journalist yet. She was a fact checker from Ottawa, Canada. And she put the pieces together and they let her write the piece and they eventually caught him because of her work. And she hadn't written a book. She had written a bunch of essays for LA Weekly. I didn't need anything except her. I didn't need the LA Weekly articles. I didn't need the LA Weekly. There was no book. There have been stories in the LA Times. There have been stories in the LA Daily News. So I had plenty of source, but I needed her. So she was the rights I had to go get. So I skipped over all the writing about the Grim Sleeper and I went right to the source and I got her rights. That allowed me to depict her. It also allowed me to have her talk to the screenwriter and tell them the entire story, which is what she did. The screenwriter, Tina Booth, brilliant screenwriter, spent time with Christine Pelisek, who was the real woman, and she told her story. So it's important because people think when they buy a book or they buy a magazine article, they buy a newspaper accounting of something, that they're getting something with that. All you're getting is the point of view of that author. Now that may be important. And if they're the sole source, then you do need it because you can't source it from anywhere else. But if it's a big story and it's been recorded and reported elsewhere in like 3 or 4 or 5 sources, you don't need a book. You don't need a magazine article. You just need, but if you're going to depict somebody as your heroine or hero, you do need their rights because you can't really depict somebody unless they're super famous without their rights. You can do the Michael Jackson or Elvis story without rights, but you can't do the Christine Pelisek story without rights. I needed the sheriff, David Reichert, who was the sheriff in Seattle who broke the Green River Killer case. I needed his rights.
What constitutes how famous someone is? Because you could have YouTubers, some of whom could be famous to a certain age group, and then older populations wouldn't. Like,
well, they'd have to be famous to a level where there has been so much coverage of them that the insurance company would feel like it's impossible to defame them because they have been in the public eye at such a high level. YouTubers would not qualify. They have to be at the Elvis level, or
sure, okay,
John F. Kennedy, or somebody whose whole life has been in the public eye, and there's hundreds and hundreds of magazines and newspapers and documentaries. Then you can get it. I mean, I think most of the Elvis and Michael Jackson movies for television and miniseries for television were done without rights.
Call Me, The Rise and Fall of Heidi Fleiss. You did a movie on Heidi Fleiss back in, what year was that? 1990s? 2000?
The thousands, I think, yeah.
Okay. We all know what the story's about, but what about the story behind the story of getting some of the talent attached?
So that's a great story. I had made a bunch of movies, true crime movies, for Jeff Wachtel, who was a friend, and he was at the time running the USA Network, which didn't make a lot of television movies, but when they did, they generally did pretty well. And one of the things that Jeff told me is they would routinely in their staff meetings come up with ideas for television movies, and they would make a poster of it, and they would go to like 10 malls in the Midwest, and they would put the posters up and have people come over, and all they would see is the title and some image, and they would say, which of these movies would you want to see most and which would you like to see least, and rank them. And he said, one after another, every time we do this, the title that comes back the highest is the Heidi Fleiss story. But we don't have a handle on it. So he said, but you're such a good storyteller. Would you do the Heidi Fleiss story? And I said to him, if you're thinking cradle to grave, like how did she become Heidi Fleiss and what did she do and who were her clients, I'm not interested. He said, was there a story you are interested in telling? I said, well, let me think about it. And I thought about it, and then I woke up one morning and I was like on a run or something, and then bingo, I thought of it. And I called him back and I said, if you'll let me make All About Eve in the world of high-priced call girls in Beverly Hills, because the true story is that Heidi stole the business from the legendary madam before her, who was Madam Alex, who had all the studios and all the producers and all of them. And Heidi was one of her girls. And then Heidi called the cops, had Madam Alex arrested for a 24-hour hold, and during that 24 hours, she stole every client. And by the time Madam Alex got out of prison, jail, county jail, I think Beverly Hills Jail, Heidi had her business. And Heidi went from being a call girl to a madam. So I said, if you let me do All About Eve, because that's an interesting story, then I'm interested. And he goes, go ahead. And Brenda Fricker played Madam Alex, and Jamie Lynn Sigler played, and that was pretty high-priced talent for him. I mean, Brenda Fricker was an Academy Award winner, and Jamie Lynn Sigler was on The Sopranos at the time. And we thought, what better than a Jewish girl from Long Island playing a Jewish girl from Encino? And it worked great.